Thank you, Marcia. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Kevin Coogan, the other faculty member, one of two here in our computer science department at Blackburn. Very excited about the 6 presentations that we have tonight. The students have put in a lot of work. We have some real creativity and some really nice ideas. And there are 6 of them, so we're going to be here for a while. So we'll just go ahead and get started. Up first is Paul Kline, who is going to combine his mother's phenomenal Tetris playing abilities with some ideas from the field of artificial intelligence. So, Paul, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Coogan. Okay, so the name of my program, I named it MKD, standing for Mother Knows Best. Subtitled, A World Record Competitor for Artificially Intelligent Tetris Play. I'm going to turn these on. Does that help? Yeah. So I don't surprise you, I'm going to be talking to you today about MKD, the program. To do so, I'm going to have to do a little bit of explaining about genetic algorithms and also about artificial neural networks, because I use both of them in my project. So, let me start with a little story. Once upon a time, I took an artificial intelligence class here at Blackburn, that was a couple years ago, and I decided for my final project that I wanted to do a Tetris player. So, I guess first we should talk about what Tetris is. If you don't know, hopefully you do. But if you don't, there are 7 tetraminos. And the way you play is one of these 7 will appear in the top of a 10 by 20 grid, and it will slowly move down in the grid. And it's your job as the player to move it left or to the right, and you can rotate it to place it in order to make complete horizontal rows. Once that happens, the entire horizontal row will disappear, and everything above it will move down by 1. So in this example, once this piece falls all the way down to here, this entire bottom row will disappear and everything will move down by 1. This is good because the way you lose the game is this pile height gets too high and you can no longer place a piece within the 10 by 20 grid. Okay? So there's Tetris in half a minute. So using a genetic algorithm, which I will talk about soon, with Tetris, I was able to place 4.2 million pieces in a single game of Tetris. So I was pretty happy about that. But sad, because from time to time, watching my Tetris player play would do things like this, where clearly this is not the best thing to do. These are what I call cringe moves. And it did this about 9.3% of the time, about 10%, so enough to be annoying, very noticeable. So my idea was to extend this project. Humans are good at Tetris, right? So let's use an artificial neural network trained on a human's Tetris playing tendencies, more specifically local Tetris expert Kline, my mother. Hence the name, Mother Knows Best. All right, so just a quick overview of what exactly MKD is. It's a 2-piece Tetris playing program. So to distinguish what that means, that just means that you know the current piece and you also know what the next piece is going to be. So 2-piece Tetris versus 1-piece Tetris where there's no program. So as I've said, it is made up by a set of weights that were developed from the use of a genetic algorithm working in tandem with an artificial neural network. Okay, before I tell you what a genetic algorithm is, I need to first talk about what's important about a placement of a piece in Tetris. Okay? So these here are 8 things that I deemed important, anything that you can count about a placement. So for instance, how many lines are cleared by placing a piece in that particular spot? That's an important count. Things like how many holes are created, right? Holes are bad. That's something important that you should count about a placement. So it's not computationally taxing at all to try every single possible combination of placement if you can somehow rate how good that placement is. So what I'm showing here is you can rate a particular placement if you have a set of weights, right, that assign an importance to each of these things that you count about a placement. Then you can try all combinations, which doesn't take long at all, and then choose the best one. And that's how the genetic algorithm Tetris player that I just showed you that placed 4.2 million pieces, that's how that worked. Okay, so a little bit more about genetic algorithm. For Tetris, the way I used it is I want to use the genetic algorithm to come up with those weights there. So, for an analogy, let's say you have a desert island and you throw a bunch of people onto the island with all sorts of different traits. You have tall people, short people, people who like to live in trees, versus people who like to build shelters on the ground. people who are hunters, people who are gatherers, and you wait about 5 generations and you come back to the island, okay? Now, those people that are still there, the people that are still alive, have gotten very good at living on that island, right? That's the whole idea of a genetic algorithm, okay? Now, instead of an island, we're using the game of Tetris. And instead of people being alive, that is analogous to the number of pieces a particular set of weights can place before game over. And instead of attributes like height, how clever you are, your strength, whether you like to live in trees or not, is analogous to what those weights actually are. Those are the things that are changing amongst members of the population and amongst, betwixt generations. So the way I built my Tetris genetic algorithm was the initial population consists of sets of weights that are randomly generated. For instance, you might make 300 of these, okay? And then each one of them plays a game of Tetris. And you pick the top, however many you want. Say you pick the top 2 performing sets of weights. Now the way I did it, I slightly mutated those to create all the members of the next population. So everybody in generation 2 either seeds from that one or that one, the 2 best performing sets of weights. Now you do this repeatedly for lots and lots of generations, perhaps over lots and lots of different islands, right? And you bring together the best results. And that's how I got that 4.2 million pieces placed. And there's an example of my genetic algorithm running. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about artificial neural networks. So these came about obviously because real neural networks are really good at what they do. The best example of that is our own brains, right? That is a neural network consisting of about 100 billion neurons of over 100 trillion connections between them. Okay? What's also attractive about neural networks is it's easy to understand how one neuron works. And then complexity arises when you put a whole bunch of them together. Probably the most popular example of an artificial neural network's use is whenever you use speech recognition on your phone. That is sent to an artificial neural network to identify what it is that you said. So here's an example, kind of an abstraction of what a real neural network would look like. And I've drawn arrows to some neurons. So, like I said, an individual neuron is fairly simple in nature. So in biology, you have a neuron that's connected to lots of other neurons, okay? And they send an electrical signal of some kind. And then each neuron performs a slightly different calculation depending on what those inputs are. Perhaps it bolsters the electrical signal, or perhaps it suppresses it, right? And then whatever the result of that calculation is, whatever it is then sent out to whatever neurons it's connected to. So very simple in nature, but like I said, you can do some really complex things when you put a whole bunch of them together. So most abstractly, what a neural network does is it gets an input of some kind, does some sort of mysterious calculation, and that's the attractive part, is you don't know how it does what it does, it just figures it out, right? And then you have an output of some kind. So for instance, you have the visual input of seeing a tiger, you do some sort of mysterious calculation to determine that you should run away. So here's an example of an artificial neural network. This specifically is a feed-forward, fully connected artificial neural network. Fully connected meaning that each of these circles is a neuron and is completely connected to each neuron in the next layer. So it's feed-forward because the data only flows that direction. Okay? A recurrent neural network would be one where it's calculated depending on its own inputs. So it's sort of recursive and self-referencing. But for my project, I just used a simple feed-forward network. That's why I showed you this one. All right, so the first question you need to answer is what is it exactly that you want your neural network to do? And I determined what I wanted mine to do was to simply answer the question, how human is this placement? So here we have a placement where the current piece is represented in red, and then the game board is represented in just all yellow pieces, right? So obviously the answer to this should be not very human at all, because I certainly wouldn't go there, and hopefully my mother, yes, would not go there either. So let's talk about the creation of MKD's artificial neural network. To create a neural network in general, I would say there are 4 steps. Get your training data that you want to train the neural network on. choose how you want to represent that data to the artificial neural network. Choose your structure, and then actually perform the training. Each of these steps is pretty large, but it won't appear so. So to gather the data, I made a program that I sent home for my mother to play, and there's two options. You can either start from a regular game of Tetris, where you get pieces that just appear from a blank screen, and then you build on from there. And I provided another option where I collected about 400 or so what I call fail sequences, which were the last 100 pieces that the genetic algorithm that I was talking about earlier, the program that resulted from the genetic algorithm actually, the last 100 pieces that Tetris games encountered before they crashed, right? So the reason why I have these two different options is because I want a nice sort of census of sample cases that could pop up, right? So we have lots of cases where the game board is very low, and then I would also have lots of cases where the game board is pretty high, just to be sure that I'm ready for anything. Okay, so I got my data. Now, you might have to do several iterations of those 4 steps to figure out what the best inputs to the neural network are actually going to be. I had to do a couple myself, and it turned out that the best inputs were actually just simply those 8 things that I showed you earlier, those things that we counted about a particular placement. Whew, okay, now structure and training, those are kind of the big ones. I mean, they're all really important, they're all big, but these two are pretty important. So I already talked about what my inputs were, but now you have to decide how many hidden layers you want. Right, in the example I showed you earlier, there was only one hidden layer, and then of course how many neurons you want in each of those hidden layers. And that was just a lot of trial and error. You just try different sizes and see how it does. And the output I decided to be just a nice numeric output, a 1 for a very human-like move, and a -1 for something a human would never do. Right? And it will spit out values anywhere between there. So perhaps your slightly human move versus a very human move. So the tool that I used to create my artificial neural network, thankfully I did not have to do it all on my own. There's a guy named Jeffrey Heaton who has a fantastic tool called MKD. So using MKD Workbench, this is an example. I don't think I mentioned activation function. Activation functions are actually just kind of a fancy way to say what exactly happens inside each neuron. Remember the calculation I was talking about earlier. Activation functions are that calculation. So here's a list of all the different kinds of activation functions that you can choose from in his workbench. These aren't all of them, but I just wanted to show them to you to show that there are lots of different options in creating artificial neural networks. So here is the final structure of my best performing neural network. I made probably around 30 or 40 networks, and this one, nice and simple, performed the best. So there's my 8 inputs there. I have one hidden layer consisting of only 2 neurons, and then your one output of anywhere between a -1 and 1, depending on how human it is. Okay, so artificial neural networks. I want to use a little analogy here of structure versus training. So say you want to train a person to play basketball, right? Well, there's two parts to that, right? First, you have to have the physical ability to play basketball, right? But that's not going to do you any good if you don't know how to play basketball. You can be the strongest person in the world, but if you don't know that throwing the ball through the hoop gets you points, you're not going to win, okay? So structure and training are 2 very important things in, like I said, creating artificial neural networks. So the way training works, these are all the different options for training. The way training works is you have your set of input data. From all your training data, I had about 3,000. And what I did was called supervised learning, where I know what I want my result to be. So I had lots of cases of what was good and lots of cases of what was bad. And what the neural network, what MKD does, is it will go through all of my training data, and for each case, it will take the inputs, come up with an output, and then compare it to what I said it should be. And then using one of these rules will alter the structure of itself to better model what the output should have been. And you do this thousands and thousands of times. The neural network that I showed you just a minute ago, that was my best performing one, I believe was trained on about 11,000 iterations all the way through the data set. So 11,000 times all the way through. So as you might guess, artificial neural networks are often criticized for being infinitely configurable. So they work well, but they're hard to work with because there's so many little different things that you can change that make a big difference. All right, I just wanted to use this for a title. Synergistic integration. All I'm trying to say is, how is it that I got these weights from the genetic algorithm and the artificial neural network? How do they work together, right? So the way I put them together is I have the weights come up with its top 5 choices of placement, right? Now, using a metric that I determined, we asked the question, should we doubt what our first choice is? You can ask me about that at the end if you want to get more into that. And if the answer is yes, that's where the artificial neural network steps in and looks at all of those and then picks the human one. So in this case, what happened is we look at this one, the first choice of the weights, and say, no, that's not human. We look at the second one, no, that's not human. And the third one is what the artificial neural network in this case chose, right? So what the GA used to choose in my first project is that first choice, where in my final seminar presentation, as you can see, we choose to do that third option there, which is exactly...
Should be a picture of your mom down there?
Yes. Just the brain part. And here's a flow chart of exactly what happens each time a tetromino falls, but I'm not going to get into that now. We can go back to that later if you wish. Okay, so how did it do? Using the best set of weights from the genetic algorithm, and also using the best artificial neural network, the one that I showed you earlier, putting those ones together in the way I just showed you, I was able to play a game that placed 21 million pieces, the very first game that I tried with this particular configuration. But this was really good, right? But I got to thinking that I trained these weights all by themselves, right? And then I trained the artificial neural network all by itself. And they don't ever interact with each other until the final product, until they're actually executing, right? They were never trained together. So my idea was, well, let's look at a little analogy. Say that the genetic algorithm is training a person to dig a hole with a shovel, right? And the artificial neural network is a person trained to dig a hole with a pickaxe, right? They both get really good at digging a hole with their specific tools. Now, when you put them together, if they're not trained to work together, they're going to keep working in the individual fashion that they learn. So the whole idea of, this is the whole idea of teamwork, right? Perhaps working together, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, right? And this actually turned out to be exactly the case here. So I trained them together, and let's look at the results, okay? But first I want to talk about someone else's results. This is Kline Fahey wrote a Tetris player back in the early 90s that was the world record for two-piece Tetris for a very long time, till about 2010. Another paper was released. And he had his software publicly available. And I played 23 of his games, and I sorted them in order of highest scoring to lowest scoring, and that result is here. I didn't have one of his phenomenal, his best game would have been an 18 million here, right? But I just played the very first 23 games of his. There was another group from Northeastern that claimed to have beaten Kline Fahey's score, and they also had their software publicly available, and I played the first 23 of theirs. And as you can see from my 23, it's almost identical. They did score a little bit better in their best, but when you average them out, it actually turns out to be a little bit less. So let's compare these players to MKD's results. So if you're wondering where they went, there they are, down there. My very best game placed 120 million pieces before crashing out of 23. So if you look at some averages, Kline Fahey's, out of the 23 games that I played, averaged placing about 1.3 million pieces. James and Glenn averaged about 1.2 million pieces, and MKB averaged just over 50 million pieces on average. So if we look at the best games, like I said, my best game using MKB was right around 120 million pieces placed. My old, that Once Upon a Time story, was 4.2 million pieces placed, and Kline Fahey's world record of about 18 million was there. So, without further ado, let's watch it. And questions. You can ask me while I set this up.
How long did it take to get?
Long time, for whatever you're going to ask. Very long time. Go on.
Play the whole game?
The game that scored 120 million, that's a good question, actually terminated early due to an automatic update. So I can only claim about 120 million pieces, but it was on its way to keep going, which is very sad. But that took just about a week, running on one of the lab computers. So what's happened now is we've paused because I told it to pause whenever it makes a correction that's different than what the weights by themselves would have chosen. So here, no, it's down there. You can see all the way on the left is the placement that the set of weights wanted to go, and then this second option, the one with the yellow writing underneath of it, that's what we have corrected its placement to. And now we can just watch. So down here at the bottom is the actual Tetris game, and up above it, those are the top 5 choices of the weights listed. Top choices at the left, and then it goes on from there. So as you can see, we've paused again. And we no longer do this first move, but we do this second move here. Any more questions? We can watch it for a week if you want.
Can you make it go any faster?
Yes, we can make it go faster. That's an excellent
Do you
question.
have an official world record title then?
No, that's a good question. So after I had these amazing results, I did some research. And like I said, in 2010, there was a paper published called Building Controllers for Tetris, where they claimed their controller averaged placing 910,000 lines on average. Mine, if you convert mine to lines cleared, averages just over 20 million lines cleared. So it did beat that one, but they said that theirs was a very conservative estimate. And more recently, very sadly, there was a group from France in 2013 that just blew any Tetris player in existence, including my own, way out of the, I don't even know. But they averaged in one-piece Tetris, so you don't know the next piece. They averaged 50 million lines, not pieces. So that converts to about 120 million pieces on average, where that was my best. Now you can't really say that theirs is definitively better than mine because you can't compare across, one piece to two piece, and there's lots of different implementation differences. But it's a safe guess, in my opinion, that theirs is probably much better than mine would be. But a couple years ago, this would have been the best. Yes?
Well, did you say that theirs was a whole team of experts and
Yeah.
it's on their own?
Yeah, they had lots of resources at their disposal. I actually emailed them and asked them some more questions about their implementation to see how it compared to mine. And they got back to me very quickly. But they had a network of about 500 computers at their disposal that they used. And they it was a team of, I think, three people. They worked on it for a while. They're part of a big research group.
Did they have a mother?
They make their mother work. It looks like it. I didn't ask. I don't know.
So you had the advantage.
I did. Yeah.
Are you gonna write it up? Since it's non-comparable with the
I have something, but it's definitely not publishable at this point. But yes, we're looking into getting something published in the journal. So it's pretty cool. If it's not the best, then as far as my research shows, it's the second best Tetris player that there is. And it uses a completely different strategy than the way they used to play Tetris. And obviously not near as many resources, right? Perhaps the whole strategy that I used to come up with MKB, if you do it on the size that they did, perhaps my performance would be comparable to what they came up with.
Now, are they using the simple Tetris?
They were, but accounting for that, in simplified Tetris, see, it's hard because they used simplified Tetris and then they also used one-piece Tetris. Simplified Tetris just means instead of a piece appearing on the board, you automatically put it where you think it should go. Whether or not you could actually move there or not, that's simplified Tetris. There is a drastic reduction of what building controllers for Tetris states to be about a 7.8 time reduction in average score. So when you make that conversion from their average, it comes down to about, I don't remember, like 6 million lines cleared on average. Somewhere between 6 and 7 lines cleared on average million. But that's still in one-piece Tetris. So comparing 6 or 7 million lines cleared on average in one-piece Tetris to around 20 million lines cleared in two-piece Tetris is not a fair comparison. There's really, like I said, in building controllers for Tetris, they state that you really can't compare across implementations. You have to run them all on the identical platform to see how they compare, which we don't really have the resources or the time to compare all of them.
Who would let you borrow
Their network of 500
Yeah.
computers.
across 3 universities?
Yeah.
On one of your slides, I noticed it was the configuration of the neural net that was the best configuration.
Yeah, sure.
So, yeah, go back to that really quick,
Aw,
if you don't mind.
wrong mouse. Go on with your question.
In the kind of bottom center area, it looks like there's a neuron or something that's kind of not connected to anything else.
Yeah. So those are, that's a good question, Brian. Those are what are called. Did I skip it already?
No.
It was after this, wasn't it?
Okay.
Okay. Well, I'm just gonna use this. Wow, it's a long slideshow.
There it is. Hello,
Okay, so the yellow ones, yeah, those are yellow because those are, and they're labeled B, those are what are called bias neurons. What those are good for, quite simply, is there's those activation functions I was talking about, which do the calculation of what kind of output should this neuron have. Those quite simply just shift what that activation function looks like. So perhaps makes it more steep or less steep, like more gradual. So that's what the bias neurons are for. They're constant. Those don't ever change throughout training. So I think here, I don't think they're listed in my weight chart here, but it's a good question.
Okay, so you guys, just to get it straight, they're just there to kind of regulate the change in the
They're
function?
like if you have a function, it's just a shifted version of that function.
Okay.
So it just, for training reasons and things, sometimes it's nice if the function is the same but just looks a little bit different, perhaps a little bit more steep or not. So that's what those are for.
Okay.
Actually, I'm glad I looked that up today because I had that same question.
Okay. If there aren't any more questions, then thank you, Paul, very much. Wonderful presentation.